Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, as always, please remember, that I have begun a Patreon to help out with this channel. If you like the show, if you value it as a resource of some kind, or if you just like me and the art that I make outside of the channel, link is in the description section below. It's $1 a month, literally $1 every month, or even just a one-time donation of $1. If you've got a dollar that you don't mind missing this month, throw it in my hat. I would be immensely appreciative. So, as the title suggests, I'm going to continue my review of Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. Now, if you remember anything, I'm going to go ahead and take the dust jacket off so it's not an issue. If you remember from the previous video, we covered the very first chapter, Old Father, Old Artificer, which was largely about Alison Bechdel's early childhood, what it was like in her home with her emotionally and physically abusive father, and then just trying to begin to broach the subject of the fact that her father had committed suicide, and also that, her father was having relationships with men, some of them underage men at that. And recognizing at the same time that her lesbian identity came about kind of simultaneously at the time of her father's coming out. But again, the first chapter is really just about getting childhood down and presenting what her early childhood was like to the reader herself. That followed the theme of kind of like the portrait of the artist as a young man. Well, now we're going to be moving into Chapter 2, which is titled Chapter 2, A Happy Death. And as always, each of these chapters are going to begin with her recreation of a found photograph, or just a photograph from her collection. Now, before we get into it, I wanted to talk a little bit about a happy death and what exactly it is. Well, like every chapter in the story, she uses a literary figure or a particular book in order to sort of examine sort of how her life came about. Again, this isn't a straight biography in the traditional sense. It's not following her life from birth up to today. It's a little bit more of a cerebral experience. She's trying to create a narrative of her father's sexuality, her father's suicide, her sexuality, and her own self in relation to her childhood experiences, her budding lesbian identity, and then just her relationship with her dad. A Happy Death is taken directly from this book here, A Happy Death by Albert Camus. Now, full disclosure, I don't like this book particularly. It's my least favorite of Albert Camus' books. I love the existentialist writers and philosophers. I've read extensively about Albert Camus. The Fall and the Myth of Sisyphus, which is going to appear in this chapter here, are my favorites. Happy Death, it's his first novel, so it's weak. But what's important here is that Albert Camus, and specifically the notion of death and happiness to some extent, or what we consider a happy death, are kind of absurd ideas that we kind of bat with back and forth throughout the entirety of our life. And so, looking at the life and work of the career of Albert Camus, one of his sort of constant themes, again, was existentialism, the philosophy that, simplistically explained, is all about choice. What are the choices that we make in this life? How do they impact us? How do they really make our reality? How do they determine our morality? And how they ultimately sort of determine our character and nature as human beings. That's a lot to discuss, obviously. That's one of the reasons why I said I can talk about Fun Home for hours. But I wanted, before I actually get into the analysis, to let the reader know that the themes that are really going to be guiding a lot of the formal elements in this particular chapter are going to be a lot of the themes that Camus talks about here in his novel A Happy Death, but then also through his great body of work, which is ultimately about what is life. Well, what life is, sort of as we are able to understand it, is absurdity. Because in Camus' existentialism, existence as we are aware of it is absurd. It's just bizarre. There's no good answer to what is the meaning of life. The existentialist answer is not what is the meaning of life, but why is life? Again, this is very simple, very basic. I'm not a philosopher. There are entire books written about this. But ultimately, at least in regards to Fun Home, is how exactly was Bruce's life a series of choices? How much choice did he really have in his life? How much choice did Allison have in her life? And at the end, did they manage to find something truly satisfying or important or relevant in the existence they had? And so, with that philosophy lecture out of the way, let's get into Chapter 2, A Happy Death, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, and let's talk about what formally she does really well in this book. Whew. All right, so now that we know at least a little bit about what existentialism is, and I'm going to try to remember to post the Wikipedia entry for existentialism in the description section below, because again, it's one of my favorite branches of philosophy. It's the one I kind of work with or accept the most, if I'm being completely honest. But two, it's really important to understand what she's really doing with Chapter 2. Now, again, she opens up Chapter 2 with the death of her father, noting that there were a lot of things happening with her dad herself, because when looking at her father's suicide, there was a lot of possible reasons for it, or a lot of potential reasons for it. The most notably being that if you read right here, Bruce had actually recently moved out of the house because he and his wife, after about 20 years of marriage, were getting divorced. And the reason, if you actually read this book, is pretty obvious. They were just not compatible from the start. Now, she does sort of begin to sort of tackle his suicide as something kind of difficult. And she notes that in the last few weeks before he died, he was reading A Happy Death by Camus. And one of the first things I want to point out is this panel right here. As always, you'll note that Allison's internal monologues are taking place usually above the panel. So in terms of layouts, your eye will usually be drawn outside of the panel first, and then the contents of the panel will then be used afterwards to deliver the information that's sort of supporting it from the start. One of the things I like about Fun Home, and probably why a nerd, anal retentive nerd like me loves it so much, is because she's not just telling details of a life. She's trying to analyze this life. And one of the ways she's kind of doing that is a kind of quasi-academic way, which is you make a claim and then you support it with evidence. Novel concept, right? I was wondering where that bookmark went. Thank you. Anyway, so if you look at this panel here, she's kind of talking about how he had actually highlighted a passage from A Happy Death. And you've probably read it already, but I'll read it out loud. He discovered the cruel paradox by which we always deceive ourselves twice about the people we love. First to their advantage, then to their disadvantage. Anybody who's married knows that pain all too well. But moving back and away from it, it's important to recognize that what do we have here? It's literally just a panel of words. She literally just copied a block of text from a novel and then put it into a panel. And then what's the next page? It's Bruce sitting in his study, drinking sherry and, reading Proust. So, in terms of our sort of layout here, this is kind of a concept-to-concept idea. This isn't something like we would see in superhero comic where, again, Superman moves his fist back and then punches Darkseid in the face. We're dealing with a lot of abstract ideas, literary references, philosophical concepts, as well as personal, emotional perceptions. And so, looking at this, the reader is kind of flip-flopping and hopping around through time. We recognize that time is moving forward in the presence here of the gutter, but really, we're not moving forward from, like, Bruce being alive to Bruce being dead, because here, in this panel, we're aware of Bruce's death, but then in this panel, Bruce is alive again, reading a book. So, in terms of closure, how exactly is the reader experiencing these details? Because again, if we hop back to previous page, Bruce is dead. We're at Bruce's actual funeral. Allison is standing in front of his casket. And then at the very end of the chapter itself, we're aware of Bruce's death because literally we get this gorgeous page of her and her brother Christian, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her other brother's name, staring down at the corpse of their father. So again, Bruce moves back and forth between being alive and seeing sequences of his life, and then back to the present moment of his being dead. So when we're talking about time, what's happening is really Allison's perception of time and the way that she's processing the experiences that she's relating to us. This is one of the reasons why sometimes people have pointed out that Allison in this book is something of an unreliable narrator, because she's relaying her perceptions. We're not getting Bruce's perceptions. And again, she's using a small passage from one of the books in her father's possession and the fact that he had highlighted it in order to kind of make some understanding of why he might have done it. But then even she herself claims that this is just speculation. And I'm at 5 minutes, and we've covered 2 panels. Just 2. And if you turn the next page, we have to look again at what elements she's incorporating into the story. You know, this panel down here where she's talking about her father's hesitancy to kind of like move out from a kind of central orbit. And then she provides a map, and then over here, a small key to all the places that he existed over the course of his lifetime. In terms of this map, he really stayed within the space of his hometown. The farthest place he ventured was the farmhouse he was remodeling right before he died. And then up here, we have another map. She's using maps to convey information about the way that Bruce was maintaining a space, how he was hesitant to move from that space. And I suppose at this point, the viewer's kind of wondering, okay, who the hell cares? What does this have to do with like existentialism and life and happiness? Well, we have to think about our own lives, because there are people like Bruce who seem very intelligent and very worldly, but then at the same time, they never leave their homes. If you've ever read anything about the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he never left his hometown village. Like, he stayed in the same town until the day he died. And yet the man, over the course of his lifetime, managed to be one of the most important philosophers around, and also the founder of a lot of really atrocious racist ideology. Like, it's just, it's awful. But again, if we're looking at Bruce's life and trying to understand aspects, we recognize something. We have a man who likes to drink sherry, who likes to talk about art and history and literature. We're talking about a man who reads Camus and Proust, and he's living in a small rural community in Pennsylvania. So, cognitive dissonance, anyone? Well, again, if we can go back to our buddy Camus and the existentialists, we have to get into the question here of how much choice did he effectively have? Now, Bechdel points out that the whole reason that Bruce returned home was because his father had a heart attack and he had to go home to maintain the family business, which was a funeral home. Now, hopefully by now people have probably clicked on gone, oh, I get it, fun home. That's it. Most of the rest of the chapter deals with, or sort of is Allison narrating the extent of her life or her day-to-day existence, talking about the fact that she and her brothers were raised in the family business of tending to a mortuary home. She would observe the corpse of her grandfather with a kind of cavalier attitude. They would play with smelling salts because that's what you did. And then at the same time, too, there's the actual process of purchasing caskets, of being alone in the old building and not really kind of wanting to be alone, in fact, being scared. Which kind of reminds me when I was a kid and my parents would go to like church in the evenings, and I would find myself oftentimes kind of alone in spaces in the church going, this place is kind of creepy AF. Which is not the reason I became an atheist, by the way. I didn't become an atheist, I am one. Anyway, back to the book. What's important here is when we're looking at fun home, it's a play on funeral home, and in fact, fun home was what the family actually would refer to the funeral home. But here again, we have the presence of death in relation to Bruce's life as well as Allison's life. And that's probably one of the most important things about it, and one of the things she uses to sort of elaborate and explain Bruce's sort of possible final decision to end his life. She notes in this spread of panels right here, where she actually includes reproduction of her father's letters, the sort of back and forth quality of how sometimes he would be very cavalier about death. And, oh yes, I had a funeral over the weekend, I had to do her makeup right, and everybody loved it. And then the other one about having to process a body of a 36-year-old who died in a car accident, being gloomy about it. So, narratively speaking, death is kind of ever present in this chapter. And death being a kind of ever present reality is really fucking hard. But I also want to emphasize again, because this is a channel dedicated to the formal aspect of comics, is looking at these two panels here, we have something really interesting. Because again, she's trying to elaborate a lot of ideas and feelings and emotions. And one of the ways she does it is not by sometimes showing her characters interacting through space, but by giving the reader panels that are basically nothing but passages from books. Again, this is not a superhero comic by any means. It's not like a young adult comic with a lot of physical action. This is very much a kind of cerebral analysis. And this is probably why people who are, how you say, not as engaged with the medium of comics because they perceive it as a medium that's largely contained of nothing but, superheroes in tight capes, or, dumb bimbos running around alien planets being chased by giant monsters and stuff. Fun Home may seem a little bit more approachable because it reads more like a kind of prose book. And again, like I just showed you, if you want to understand a lot of the analysis that she's talking about in these sentences on top of the panels, you have to actually read the selections of texts. This is a tool that Bechdel uses throughout the book in order to sort of supplement her ideas and her analysis of why Bruce may have jumped in front of that sunbeam bread truck. And we'll talk about that in a later passage. But it's important to note, again, she's using these formal elements, such as maps and passages from books by Camus, to sort of try to tackle the notion of, my father killed himself. This is absurd. Which, again, if I can return to the part where she and her brothers are staring at her father's body in the funeral home, again, there's a kind of absurd quality to it because it doesn't make any sense. How can somebody who was living and who has been around for so long just suddenly be gone? And especially somebody who dealt so much around death. We all grew up around death, and now Dad's gone. Now, part of the struggle I probably have is that I'm still pretty young. I'm 32 years old, and both of my parents are still alive. So, obviously, that disconnect is not there. But, and here I'll be completely honest and personal, is as somebody who suffers from depression and suicidal thoughts and tendencies, and as somebody who has at one point made a plan to take his own life, the absurdity of existence is something I guess I'm a little more acclimated to. And then perhaps, too, any regular viewer of the show will observe there's a little picture up here to my right, always sort of taped to the Don't Panic from Hitchhiker's Guide. That photo up there is the photo of a friend of mine who committed suicide in 2018. And I'm not going to lie, when she killed herself, it hit me really, really hard. And it took my depression, which is something that I had always internalized and been aware of, and really made it somehow painfully more real. Now, I'm better than where I was several years ago. I didn't handle the death really well at all. It took me months to really come to, like, a comfortable place with it. And even to this day, I'm not saying that I'm still okay with it, because I'm not. I miss my friend. I wish I had been there more while she was alive. But one of the things that sort of still constantly strikes me is the kind of absurd quality of it. And maybe if I can offer one more real-life experience here to kind of tackle this. At my job at the public library where I work, I index obituaries from the local newspapers. There's a lot of people out there who want to study their genealogy or basically just want to find some kind of closure about their relatives, and so there's websites and organizations dedicated to indexing obituaries for people to, find out what happened to their great-grandfather, or happened to their mom, or happened to their aunt, or some family member who had passed away. And obituaries for some people are the way to do that. The problem is going to work every day and having to index the obituaries of people who are 104 years old, doing the obituaries for people who are 32 years old, and then sometimes even having to do the obituary for a baby who was born and died on the same day. it's really hard. And you kind of have to become inured to it. And so this is the part where I now have to say a bit of trigger warning, because probably one of the most potent moments in the book is when Bruce Bechdel calls Allison to the back of the funeral home because he, quote, needs to find a pair of scissors, and he can't find it, and he asks her to bring it to him. And again, there will be some very graphic elements here, so please be prepared. Allison, as a child, an 8-year-old, goes to the back and observes the body of a grown man who had been hit by a truck. And we observe in this moment her analysis of coming back there and seeing not only the image of a fully grown naked man being disturbed by his genitals right off the bat, but then also observing the hollow cavity in his chest. It's a really hard moment, because if you have any empathy for a child whatsoever, you recognize, what are you doing, Bruce? What the hell? And that was the first reaction I had the first time I ever read this book, was shocked and disturbed. This is about my 10th or 12th time reading Fun Home, and when I get to this passage, I'm no longer shocked by it. And as she points out in the next page, one of the ways that she kind of acclimated to her father's suicide and experienced the emotion she kind of wished she had had was by telling other people about it. It's a hard thing to process, but formally speaking, by showing the actual cadaver, by showing the sights that she had seen in this really, really graphic way, and then providing an sort of, not hypothetical scenario, but a kind of casual example, you can kind of see what she's doing narratively in her analysis. She's trying to show how she managed to sort of deal with the absurdity of her father's suicide. Now, again, if we look at this panel again, and I apologize, I recognize this is a hard page, but if you look at it, what's important here is that the previous page, we had 4 panels, 2 sort of small squares, preceded by these 2 long vertical panels where we see the room in which Bruce is doing a lot of the processing work, and then this long vertical page where Allison is like tying up the cord to an old school vacuum cleaner when her father calls her. The next page, we get the long horizontal shot of Bruce standing by the body, followed by the details of the body, and then Allison's stunned face. Using this very careful presentation, Bechdel is able to really, at least in my estimation, successfully demonstrate the shock and the kind of callousness her father had in terms of exposing her to the reality of death. And so, as we consider the absurd and the notion of what is and is not a quote-unquote happy death, Bechdel's really sort of looking into the second chapter to kind of show that the notion of a happy death is kind of a difficult one. In fact, the concept of death itself is difficult, because how exactly are we supposed to respond to it? Their initial response to death is a fundamental sense of absurdity. Somebody who is here, who is existing, is now just forever gone. And you're never going to talk to them again. And you're never going to see them again, hear their voice, what have you. It's absurd. And absurd in this case is not just meant to be funny. It's meant to be just shocking and stupefying. How could this happen? I don't know how to react to this. Well, Camus does that exact job really well in A Happy Death, and I would argue even more so in this book here, The Myth of Sisyphus, where he asks the ultimate philosophical question, at least to his view, which is, should we kill ourselves? By the way, before anybody asks, no, you shouldn't. Like, really? Camus comes to the same conclusion. Suicide is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. Also, coffee and orgasms exist. Why would you kill yourself? Come on. Come on. There's no good reason for it. You've got Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. I just bought a Switch today, and I'm so excited to play it. And I'm looking at it. It's almost 20 minutes long. Holy crap, we need to finish this video soon. This has all just been a way to kind of explore the notion of death, but then really see how Allison is doing this. And what do we see? We see her using maps and passages from literature, as well as a kind of few actual real-world examples from her life. She's using a kind of abstract analysis but then also the real fundamental reality of her life to try to tackle why death is so complicated for her. Because she grew up in a funeral home. She should be kind of inured to death at this point. And yet, the death of her father, while not necessarily being a tragic experience for her, or at least not a completely tragic experience, was still a hard one because losing a parent, and I can't speak from firsthand experience yet, but it changes everything. And it's really absurd that the people who are always there are suddenly gone. And again, formally, how is this delivered? By letters, by passages in novels, by a very careful execution of ideas balanced with reality. And this is one of the reasons why I really love Fun Home, is because rather than simply show her father and her mother and her and her brothers interacting throughout, she tries to take a more macro perspective and situate her parents in the conditions of their time period and in their lives, and try to figure out what were the choices that they made and what were the choices that other people made for them, and how did this ultimately, shape them. So, I think that's a good enough reason to explain why Chapter 2 is really interesting formally, and now, let's do the last hurrah and call it a day. Whew. So, Chapter 2, A Happy Death. It's a heavy one, and it's a hard one, and again, it's so much a reason of why I love Fun Home so very much. And I'm going to put the dust jacket back on because I can see the colors of my video changing back and forth. But whatever the case, that was Chapter 2. Next one, we will be talking about Chapter 3, That Old Catastrophe, which is all about the marriage between Bruce and, oh my god, I've forgotten Allison's mom. I've only read this book like 12 times. We'll figure it out, and we'll put it right at the start of the next video. But, hey, seriously, thank you for watching. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Also, apologies for how long this video was. I didn't intend to talk or yabber on this much. But, nevertheless, thank you. Just a reminder, as always, Fun Home was put out by Hoffman Mifflin's, which means it's not going to be through a more sort of traditional comics publisher. It's a more mainstream publisher. And so your hometown comic book shop may not have a copy of it. Then again, this graphic novel was actually translated into a Broadway musical, which won the Tony several years ago. So a lot of comic shops these days are starting to carry a more diversified range of material. So go to your local comic book shop, see if they've got a copy of Fun Home, and if they don't, see if they can order it for you. Also, don't forget, you live in a world with public libraries, so check out your public library, check out their comic and graphic novel section. If they don't have one, or if they don't have the book itself, just ask for an interlibrary loan form. I guarantee you they should be able to get a hold of it. And as always, thank you so much for your time. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.